Hello everyone, my name is Jane Anderson and I'm from Homes England. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Summer Learning Programme. This offers a series of knowledge sharing sessions on topics you have told us are of interest to you. And today's event is a Passivhaus case study on the Greenhaus development project, which is part of the English Cities Fund Salford Regeneration. So this Summer Learning Programme is brought to you by Homes England's Local Government Capacity Centre. The topic of the session is an important focus in Homes England's new strategic plan. This slide shows the new mission, which in a nutshell is to create places like Greenhaus in Salford that people will be proud to call home. Next slide, please. And here are our objectives outlined in our strategic plan. This session is one of three created around our objective to help build a housing and regeneration sector that works for everyone, which I think is exemplified in the Greenhaus project. Next slide, please. This slide summarises who the Local Government Capacity Centre are and what we do. We established the centre following extensive research and consultation with you across local government and with a wide range of other partners to determine what authorities most need support with and how this can best be achieved. We look forward to hearing how we did in the survey poll at the end of the session. Next slide, please. So on the screen, you'll see a breakdown of the session today. So once I've finished introducing the session, you'll meet Phil Marsden from Muse and Kirk Partington, Head of Development. Kirk is from Salford City Council and he'll talk about the significant challenge of the regeneration programme, setting the scene and giving his perspective as a local government partner. And we'll hear from Phil Marsden, who is Director of Project Management for Muse and the Development Manager in the English Cities Fund Partnership. Phil is passionate about creating positive change and is leading Muse's approach on all things related to the environment, social impact and governance. He'll talk about the opportunity from a developer's perspective. Then Kurt and Phil will hand over to John Hartnett, Managing Director, and Sam Godfrey, Senior Design Manager, who are both from Eric Wright Construction. John will talk about their cultural shift as an organisation, and Sam will talk about on-site practices and key differences working on a Passivhaus project. John and Sam will then introduce Phil Summers, Development Director at Salix Homes. Salix are a partner to the Greenhaus project and end purchaser, and Phil is a strong advocate of Passivhaus. He'll explain why Passivhaus is simply good business and leads to better outcomes for residents. We'll be finishing with a Q&A session, and I'll then be drawing the session to a close with some final thoughts and take-home messages from the panel and a further poll to get some immediate feedback on the session. I'm now going to hand over to our first couple of presenters. So Kurt, Phil, when you're ready, over to you now.
Thanks, Jane, and good morning, everyone. Before I hand over to Phil, as Jane said, my name's Kurt Partington. I'm the Head of Development at Salford Council, and one of the strategic aims of the role is to deliver high-quality growth and development within the City Council. What I wanted to do for the first few slides that I've got is just to set the context of the particular case study that the team are going to run through today. Obviously, the majority of people, in terms of the poll, is about their understanding. So less is more, I suppose, from me. The project or the site is one of a number that's been delivered or has been delivered through our strategic partnerships with the English Cities Fund. And that's a long-term element. And for those who know the city, this development agreement was signed back in 2006. It's part of this long-term public-private partnership. And it was about fundamentally addressing comprehensive change in a part of the city where every indicator was pointing in decline. So whether it's population, health, crime implications, it needed a strategic approach. So as it says, the Greenhouse project that we're going to hear about today is just another example of a quality development within a well-established regeneration project. Next slide, please. So it's not just Greenhouse that is relevant here. The slide that I just want to talk about is the context of that strategic, significant project, and it was Salford's largest plan application when it came through, and we've only got 3 plots left to sort of see to come forward. So in terms of the summary that was given to me, we're immensely proud of what's been achieved in Salford's growth and the change that we've taken place. We're immensely proud of grappling opportunities and challenges and what we've achieved. So whilst we're immensely proud of the developments that have taken place, Greenhaus is just another example of that. The point I want to make around it is positive partnership. So being in a partnership enables us to address challenges. So when this first started 15 plus years ago, it was about addressing challenges of decline. We're actually now dealing with some of the issues, whether they are in response to the positive change or whether it's the declaration of a climate emergency. So where we are today, and before this Greenhaus project came to fruition, it was then looking at providing affordable homes. It was about looking at, as I say, responding to a climate emergency, and there set the context, the challenge effectively for our partnership. So in essence, that's how the challenge of Greenhaus emerged. It was responding to new challenges within a partnership. So what I'm going to do now is hand over to Phil Marsden. He's going to take up the baton of that challenge and how, as a partnership, we responded to that challenge.
Thank you, Kurt, and morning, everybody. Good to see so many people on the Teams call. Next slide, please. So we've got, before I get started, we'd like to hear from you again. We've got another poll here. We'd like to just gauge an understanding of how many people have been involved actively in a Passivhaus scheme. So if you won't mind just completing this poll, again, using the scale 1, not being involved at all, to 5 being extensively involved. We'll be really interested in the results on that. Just while you're doing that, I'll just give an overview of what I'm going to cover. I'm going to provide an intro to Greenhaus and really give an overview of our journey to Passivhaus on that scheme. I'm going to talk about what we as a developer see as the benefits, and then I'm going to hand over to Eric Wright Construction, who will talk you through things from their perspective. We've got some really good results coming in on the poll there, and it looks like the vast majority, actually 70% have not been involved in a Passivhaus scheme at all, with only sort of 3% being extensively involved. So that's really interesting and informative for us. So thank you for doing that. If we could have next slide. So before we get into Greenhaus specifically, I thought it'd be worth giving a very quick overview of the Passivhaus accreditation scheme. So Passivhaus is an approach to building which is focused on reducing operational energy and improving occupant health and well-being. It's focused on high quality design and construction, which is then certified through a quality assurance process. There's essentially 3 levels of Passivhaus as shown on the screen. The main difference between the 3 is really about how much additional energy is produced by the home against what the home will actually consume. There's lots of specific targets which need to be addressed to obtain Passivhaus certification, including energy and cooling demands, levels of renewables, max levels of overheating and air tightness ratings. And by adopting a Passivhaus approach and reducing energy demand in line with their standards, this facilitates the delivery of homes that are net zero in operation. Next slide, please. So onto Greenhaus. Greenhaus is one of, like Kurt says, one of the last phases of of residential in our Salford Central development that we've been working on for 15, 20 years now with the council. It sits on Chapel Street in Salford and is 96 affordable 1 and 2 bed apartments. Greenhaus is going to be Passivhaus Classic certified. And it is a landmark project. It's one of the first Passivhaus certified apartment schemes in the UK. There's quite a lot of houses been designed and built to Passivhaus certification standards, but not many apartments. So it is a bit of a one-off at the moment. Next slide. You can see the main partners involved on the screen. I'll touch on this later, but the key point I wanted to get across here, and it's something Kurt mentioned, is that we couldn't have delivered Greenhaus without any of those parties. And working in partnership with Kurt and his team at Salford, with Phil and the team at Salix, with Eric Wright, has been absolutely key to the success of Greenhaus. Everyone involved has taken a positive, long-term view on the project, which has meant that we've had to deal with some of the challenges that have been thrown at us by trying to achieve the Passivhaus certification. And it's absolutely fundamental, and you'll hear that a few times as we go through the slides today, how important that partnership working is. Next slide, please. So whilst Greenhaus is a fantastic project on its own merits, the project is helping us address wider challenges around delivery of low energy and net zero homes. As we know, the government has a target of net zero emissions for the UK by 2050, but with an equal focus on creating a positive social impact and addressing needs of local communities. In Greater Manchester, there's a significant housing demand, as there is around the country, particularly in the affordable sector. And it's crucial that new housing is built to low energy standards to avoid adding to the retrofit challenge that exists. Greenhaus is allowing us and all the stakeholders involved to massively expand our knowledge on how to deliver low energy homes, particularly in the apartment sector. And we're learning some invaluable lessons. And those lessons we're learning will allow us to upscale the delivery in a commercially viable way, which is really, really important. And we're already looking at the delivery of Greenhaus version 2. And we're also willing to share knowledge with other developers, with designers, contractors and funders, so that the lessons we've learned on Greenhaus don't need to be repeated by others. Next slide, please. So how did Passivhaus come about on Greenhaus? Well, we were in the early stages of design on Greenhaus, and we were already designing a low energy apartment scheme in line with Muse's sustainability strategy. And we had given some consideration to Passivhaus, but viability was a considerable challenge, something we'll touch on. We were looking for funding partners and got introduced to Salix through their long-standing relationship with Salford Council. You'll hear from Phil Summers from Salix later, who is incredibly passionate about delivering low energy homes, which is very well aligned to Muse's sustainability approach. So there was a sort of good fit, naturally good fit there with Salix. And it was Salix who asked us actually if we could deliver the scheme to Passivhaus certified standards, and if so, what would the cost be? At this point in the project, we were in sort of stage 2 design, but we were delighted to accept the challenge. We'd already designed the mass and orientation of the building to ensure it performed as efficiently as possible. And after a period of review, we sort of set out the key design changes that would need to be made, really around the introduction of air source heat pumps for hot water, improvements to air tightness, attention to detail around thermal bridging and better quality windows. Along with the certification fees, this equated to an extra £2 million, which was around 10% of the build cost. I'll come on to that in a sec. We also acknowledged that we had to get early contractor involvement. So we'd worked with Eric Wright previously on previous residential phases at Salford Central. And from discussions with them, they showed a fantastic appetite to meet the Passivhaus challenge. So Eric Wright therefore became a key member of our team, our design team, and worked very closely with us to ensure the design was deliverable and that risks were identified and dealt with as best we could. And it became a really fine example of how to work in partnership with a contractor. And that's, like I said before, been key to the success of Greenhaus. And I actually strongly believe that you couldn't deliver a Passivhaus scheme by following a traditional sort of old-fashioned procurement approach. And one of the key points was to ensure that Eric Wright had a contractual obligation to deliver the Passivhaus scheme. And neither of us or Eric Wright had done that before. But through that early engagement, including Eric Wright's supply chain as well, we found a way to understand and manage the risk such that we could commit contractually to Passivhaus requirement to both Salix and likewise Eric Wright's to us. And Eric Wright's will talk more about progress to date, which has been challenging. It's been rewarding, but we remain on programme. And with the first air tests having been done, meeting the really onerous requirements that they've been passing. So really good progress on site. Next slide, please. So this slide just gives an overview of what a Passivhaus apartment looks like. In summary, we've got triple glazed Passivhaus certified windows, maximum 20% glazing, so there's less glazing than probably normal, with sort of wider, shorter windows to maximise daylight. Mechanical ventilation heat recovery units, which are located as close to the external wall as possible. That's absolutely fundamental, and that minimises heat loss through the ductwork. A super airtight facade with very carefully thought out junction details, all electric heating, air source heat pumps providing hot water, high levels of insulation, exceptional U values, and a building form that's focused on creating a low sort of form factor. Obviously then really good, there's a focus on really good construction quality to make sure that all comes together. There's no sort of wacky technology in the apartments, there's no silver bullet, and typically the apartments look like any other city centre apartment. Next slide, please. So I mentioned before the £2 million uplift to meet Passivhaus certification, and this was presented to Salix and fully embraced as the way forward. Salix have been absolutely fundamental to the delivery of Greenhaus. They've got an innovative approach in support of highly sustainable, affordable homes, committed to the delivery of the certified standard. There's quite a lot of talk at the moment in industry about delivering to Passivhaus standards, but not necessarily achieving the certification. Both ourselves and Salix see the absolute benefits and the rigour involved in actually obtaining the certificate, which means the homes that we produce and build will actually perform in accordance with the design, and that's such a fundamental benefit of Passivhaus. Like Eric Wright, Salix have worked with us as a true partner and have been flexible, accepting design changes necessary to support Passivhaus delivery, both in the design stages and some of the things we've come across on site. And Salix have taken a long-term view. The financial modelling supported the £2 million cost uplift when you take into account reduced energy bills and the fact that no retrofit will be needed in years to come. You'll hear from Phil Summers, who's the Passivhaus champion that we've referred to on the slide here, and we've had a number of Passivhaus champions in each organisation on this project, and I think having those people involved and that personal drive has been so, as well as the organisational push, but having those individuals has also been so important. Next slide, please. So we've got another poll here, which we'll just launch. If you would complete this poll, that would be grateful. So this is about what do you think the main benefits are of Passivhaus. So if you could just type in your responses there. I'm going to cover this on the next slide, so it'd be interesting just to see how the benefits that you see align with what we see. So there's lots of benefits there coming through around energy, low carbon, low cost to run, reduce carbon footprint, carbon reduction. So a lot around carbon and energy, which I think is probably what I sort of expected. Lower bills is a good one there. Okay, we've got some good responses. If we could just move on, please. So I think it's interesting to see some of those responses because the majority of those were focused around energy and lower costs, which is clearly a key benefit. And we estimate with some really good certainty actually that the energy costs of Greenhaus will be 68% less than a typical good quality new build. And actually there's some statistics that suggest it will be around 90% less than a sort of older, more traditional home. So absolutely a key benefit is that reduction in energy cost, both from a financial perspective for those occupants, but also from a carbon perspective in terms of using less energy. But the other thing that I wanted to highlight, and Phil will touch on this later, is that there are some very strong proven health benefits as well with Passivhaus homes. Passivhaus homes create a greater level of fresh air, condensation-free environment, removing risk of mold, damp, cold spots. That increase in fresh air reduces levels of pollutants. And there's some very interesting statistics about how Passivhaus homes have improved lives of people with chronic illnesses and disabilities. So I think there's as much benefit that comes through Passivhaus homes in the sort of health and well-being as there is around reduction in energy costs. The other thing I've noticed is, this is a sort of build quality point, is that the culture on the site that has been developed by Eric Wright, you'll have seen the picture before, it said no gaps bigger than 3 millimeters on the back of the high-vis vest. That attention to detail that comes from Passivhaus is flowing through the whole Eric Wright's team, and the culture on site is absolutely fantastic. And the quality of everything, not just the Passivhaus elements, is now we're seeing because of that attention to detail and that culture. And clearly these homes won't need to be retrofitted in 2050, which is clearly a massive benefit. That's all from me. Thank you very much. Thanks for doing the polls. I'm going to hand over to the Eric Wright's team now.
Thanks, Phil, for that. So I'm John Hartnett, the Managing Director for Eric Wright Construction. I'll be joined by Sam, who I'll hand over to shortly. So next slide, please. Not make a faux pas there. So I'll just cover a general overview of the contractor's perspective and the challenges and benefits, which will then allow Sam to dive into the detail, and he's got an absolute understanding of the intricacies of everything. And 3mm gaps are a big thing, but there's a lot more to Passivhaus from a contractor's view. So the opportunity for us, we're all being driven towards a more environmentally responsible development and construction. And it kind of dovetails everything that Phil Marsden's just said, and obviously Phil will cover from Salix as well. So I don't plan on repeating that, but I think it's important we all recognise, you know, as influential organisations within the sector, we must play our part in becoming more sustainable moving forward. And for us, if we can be at the forefront of this, it's undoubtedly allows access to future work through frameworks where we can evidence a proven track record for delivering Passivhaus at a commercial scale. You know, and it gives us the option and the opportunity for repeat business with sensible clients such as English Cities, Salix and Muse, who recognise the importance of the fabric first approach that Passivhaus offers. And we can also use that to educate new clients and bring them on board as well, who can either embrace Passivhaus within the residential sector or transfer elements of it to commercial offices, education, industrial. Moving on to upskilling. There's probably a view that construction is quite a simple process, but I think the truth is quite different, and it probably has been for some years. And the majority, if not all, construction professionals, certainly in commercial contracting, is that they're very technical and precise in nature, and they find the Passivhaus opportunity quite challenging. And everyone's learning. So people who've been in the industry for 20 years, this is a first for themselves. And it gives them that challenge, and they recognise how they can be involved in this project and showcase it for the future. So Phil was covering there about the Muse view, and Phil Summers will explain the reasoning opting for Passivhaus accreditation and not just building to Passivhaus standards. To reinforce that point, Passivhaus forces us to go the extra mile in providing a quality engineered product and to interrogate long-held views on products and good and assumed best practice, which Sam will explain in more detail. But certainly from the contractor's perspective, there's an element of jeopardy in that we have to be able to construct and prove the building at every step through the inception, design and construction through modelling, inspection and rigorous on-site testing to a standard we have never tried to achieve before. And with doing that, obviously, comes jeopardy. And with that jeopardy comes caution. And then with the caution comes diligence, which, as Phil mentioned, results in a quality scheme, not just in the Passivhaus elements of the scheme, but the entire build. Digital quality assurance, obviously that's not something new, but again, Passivhaus has offered us the opportunity as an organisation to move to a new level of digital quality assurance. And we can use this best-in-class standard to transfer over to our other projects, and it aids in enhancing the culture and the standards through our organisation. And construction is similar to many industries and sectors in that it's heavily regulated and legislated for. But in truth, it's built on people and talent. And Passivhaus has allowed us to develop relationships with consultants and supply chain we wouldn't have created previously, and to incorporate those into our wider business model, and use those principles again and dilute them through everything. And it's been really, really good. Finally, future regulations and the future home standards. It will be mandatory to produce significantly less CO2, and Phil mentioned about being net carbon zero by 2050. So, and he also mentioned about the 10 to 12% uplift in price to achieve Passivhaus. But that gap becomes smaller as the building regulations standards become greater. The gap to achieve Passivhaus is smaller. So if we can achieve it now, we can use that knowledge and information to actually achieve the future home standard on future projects. I'll now pass you on to Sam, who will cover all the specifics of achieving Passivhaus. Thanks very much.
Thanks, John. Next slide, please. So yeah, just as an introduction, I'm Sam Godfrey. I am one of the design managers at Eric Wright, and as Phil touched on, I personally and as a business, we've been fortunate enough to have the opportunity to be involved in this scheme from a very early stage. Just as the decision was being made to start exploring Passivhaus when the funding became available. And so, these first few slides are just going to touch on that in a little bit more detail and how that sort of how we believe that sort of benefited the scheme and allowed the scheme to be viable, not just from a commercial perspective, but also sort of from a contractual perspective, as John was just touching on then. I am going to be going into a little bit of detail, so I'll apologise in advance for that. But it's very difficult to talk about Passivhaus without getting bogged down in a little bit of the detail. So yeah, I mean, firstly, I want to say when we got involved very early on, and the benefits of that, it's not just Eric Wright Construction and the contractor. It also allowed us to engage with our supply chain and bring them on board and bring them along the journey with us. And what that allowed us to do really was it allowed us to sort of prove, but more importantly, disprove some of the proposed specification enhancements to make sure that what was actually being put forward and carried forward into the design, before the planning was submitted, before the tender documents and the contract documents were all finalised, make sure that what was actually being taken forward was providing value for money. And how that actually looked in practice was, we was attending all the design team meetings from a very early stage, all the design workshops, the Passivhaus advisors, the Passivhaus consultant, the Passivhaus certifier, and we were just sort of being sponges to some degree and taking on all their information, all their recommendations. You should be doing this, you should be doing that, this is good practice, that's good practice. And we generated what actually ended up getting referred to quite simply as the Passivhaus shopping list at the end of that process. Where basically everything that had been mentioned in all these meetings and the specification documents and the guidance documents that have been shared in terms of sort of, if you were going to build the perfect Passivhaus, this is what you would do. They all got listed out, and that allowed us to start costing them alongside our supply chain. And when I talk about, more importantly, disproving some of those proposed enhancements, I'll give you, I've got a couple of examples there, but I'll give you one particular example because I'm conscious of time, being the masonry support brackets. So the initial advice we had from one of the Passivhaus designer was that we needed to firmly break the masonry support brackets. But because we was able to get our supply chain on board, interrogate that with the masonry support supplier from a very early stage, what it allowed us to do is actually do calculations on that. And when you factored in this thermal packer on the masonry support, what it did, it actually made the through bolt longer as a result, which actually reduced the load bearing capacity of the masonry support. So it ended up meaning that rather than having masonry support every 2 levels of brickwork, as you would typically expect on a high-rise building, we had to have every level. So it was becoming counterproductive. So when we actually modelled that in the what gets referred to as the PHPP model, which is basically the mechanism that Passivhaus designers use to verify the design and to basically give you the output to demonstrate that you're actually achieving the heating demand and the PAR limits for certification. When all this was fed into the Passivhaus model, and as you can probably imagine, there was lots of things getting taken out and getting put back in while we was doing a bit of a trial and error process in some regard to see what was the perfect, most optimum design to deliver Passivhaus and actually make it affordable, which is the key thing here. So, using the masonry support, for example, when they modelled that, even though the thermal packer did reduce the thermal bridging impact of the masonry support brackets, because you was doubling it in quantity, it actually had a negative impact in the Passivhaus model. And I think that's a really good example that I use quite a lot, in that, if you hadn't had early contractor input, if you hadn't had that early engagement with the supply chain, you could quite easily have had a design team that took on board those Passivhaus consultant comments and incorporated that into the specification, and it could quite easily got priced into the scheme unnecessarily. And there was quite a few examples like that where we actually took and what the Passivhaus shopping list allowed us to do when we started costing all these different specification enhancements. It allowed us to sort of rag rate them to some extent, and in terms of what was actually, what was the biggest cost uplift, what was the least cost uplift, is that providing, what's the heating demand impact of taking that out, what's the heating demand impact of putting that in, And it allowed us to play around with lots of different little, scenarios of the enhancements to actually come up with the most cost-effective solution. And it was a tested solution that actually had live cost feedback from the supply chain. Next slide, please. So yeah, as I just mentioned, it wasn't just us that were important to this. It was our subcontractors and our supply chain. And what we tried to do is identify the sort of Passivhaus critical subcontractors early. And we were very fortunate in working with a client such as ECF, who and Salix, who allowed us to sort of partner with key supply chain members early in the process, rather than having to get bogged down into a process of keeping certain packages competitive as long as possible to get the absolute the last few pennies out of a competitive market. When actually we believe it generated more cost efficiencies on a Passivhaus scheme to partner with certain key subcontractors, certainly earlier on, because what that allowed us to do, and there's a list of a few there, mechanical, electrical contractor, we're obviously fundamental in pricing various different, giving us live cost feedback on various different air source heat pump specifications, various different MVHR unit specifications, and live cost feedback on that. The window and curtain walling was always a bit of a sticking point, because we were conscious of just how critical the window U value target was in achieving the overall energy performance of the building. And something that we found out we realized quite early on in the process is that not all the window suppliers we were talking to could actually give us the data that the Passivhaus model required. The Passivhaus model is very data hungry, and it calculates its own U values in its own certain way, and it's not necessarily the same way that the supply chain does their calculations. So, for example, a window supplier would normally give you an average U value calc, but the Passivhaus model requires the UF value of every single section of the frame, every single interface, the spacer SI value, the G value of the glazing, the cold bridging impact of the plates and the straps that's used to fix it, even down to the screws that are used to fix it back to the envelope. All that was sort of interrogated from a very early stage to make sure that we weren't using prices that weren't necessarily giving us what we thought they were giving us, and we ended up, and because of that, we were very conscious of that. We wanted to make sure that the actual contract specification reflected what needed to be delivered. So there was a lot of early interrogation of various different operators prior to getting his contracts, and wrote that into the contracts as the preferred windows, as the preferred window system, and that was obviously the subcontracts was pivotal to that. And I've put steel framing system there, the SFS. Even though that wasn't a design package, it was the SFS is a supply only package, and it's just a subcontractor that's installing it on site, because it was so fundamental in developing the program. And also the air tightness, because the airtight membrane that you can see there in that picture, the red Procter Raptite product that some people might be familiar with, that was our primary airtight line that we were relying on. It's not been around for too long. It has been used on high-rise buildings for probably 2 or 3 years now. Does have an care effect, and obviously regulation got tighter on the combustibility of membranes and external walls over 18 meters. It has you are seeing it more and more, because it is becoming more cost viable. But it does have massive air tightness benefits, because what it does, it allows you to bring the airtight membrane on the outside of the SFS rather than relying on a vapor control layer on the inside. And it's self-adhesive, so you're not relying on tapes and stuff to get the seal. It goes on very similar to wallpaper in some effects. But our tried and tested supply chain wasn't familiar with it as a product, so having the opportunity to engage with them very early in the process didn't just allow us to get comfortable with the scheme, it allowed them to get comfortable with the scheme as well. So they weren't pricing risk onto the job, from like an unfamiliarity perspective. It allowed them to get comfortable with the durations. It allowed them to get comfortable with the installation tolerances that we're asking them to deliver. And we believe that bringing them along the journey with us certainly sort of had a commercial betterment than if we would have just sent out a load of tender documents. We also had the opportunity to sort of build a mock-up of the proposed external wall construction and the airtight membrane, and we actually had the opportunity to do an air test on that. With a mock-up window to make sure that we were comfortable that what we was actually proposing was was fit for purpose and was deliverable, which, you know, as John was just touching on, was fundamental really, as in terms of us being able to commit to signing a contract to say we could actually deliver Passivhaus. You know, when, you know, these kind of air tightness levels just haven't been achieved on a high rise scale before, to our knowledge, certainly since Regulation 7 came into effect and combustible materials were no longer permitted. So next slide, please. So some of the key risks and mitigation measures that we've had to deal with along the way. Program, as I've touched on, was a key one, and one of the mantras we've been sort of trying to stick to throughout the process is avoiding the temptation to reinvent the wheel. We you know, another example of, you know, some of the advice we had from the Passivhaus consultants early on was that you know, there is a precedence project down in London that's, you might be familiar with, AGAR, I believe it's called, which was delivered a high-rise apartment block to Passivhaus standards that has been delivered, but it was prior to Regulation 7 coming into effect. So it didn't have the same constraints in terms of the materials that could be used in the external wall, and also it was built with a blockwork in a leaf. So the Passivhaus advice we had was that that's the route we should be going down. Build the inner leaf in blockwork. That would allow us to do a parge coat on it to get the air tightness, and it would also allow us to blow the insulation to the cavity to make sure, to guarantee that the gaps in the insulation line was less than 3 millimeters. We didn't complete this straight away. We just, you know, we explored it, we programmed it out, but unfortunately, obviously, as you can imagine, trying to deliver that scheme with a wet trade on your critical path effect, so it's going to stop you from commencing your fit out, is very challenging. And I think when we did map it out and added on a bit of time for sort of inclement weather, it was coming out as about an extra 20 weeks, which just the prelims alone associated with that made the job not viable from a commercial perspective. So we started sort of trying to rethink how can we actually provide our client with some program certainty, provide ourselves with program certainty, so we can commit to a date that's palatable, and actually stacks up from a commercial perspective. And we went down the route of trying to sort of fit Passivhaus into our tried and tested methods of already, you know, delivering high-rise residential schemes, which is why we ended up going on the SFS route, because it means we could give more certainty on program, on the durations, and as we got stuck into the detail, actually we satisfied ourselves that, you know, the gaps in insulation could be delivered, albeit with a bit more care and attention, using sort of, you know, mineral wool insulation in the SFS line, and more typical high-rise construction details. Again, nothing that's really been done before from a Passivhaus perspective before, to our knowledge. We also, again, fortunately, we had, you know, the client facilitated us the opportunity to sort of have that much time up front that we got a really good understanding of what interim testing and inspections and hold points would be required. So that we weren't just having to, again, just add a lot of risk time onto the end of the program for the unknown. We had a really, you know, before we got into contract, we had a really good understanding of exactly every single hold point that would be required to make sure we were meeting the certification standards. We had what got referred to as the benchmark tracker, which effectively anything that had an impact on the Passivhaus results was benchmarked. I mean, by that, an example of that was the SFS installation. So, you know, when that was installed for the first time on site, you know, an area was agreed to make sure that we were achieving the standards, and I will come on to that on my next slide in a little, as one of the lessons learned that we've found during the process. But yeah, you know, the program was very well detailed at contract, you know, mapping out all hold points and also all the interim air test inspections that were required. So because the airtight membrane was moved to the outside of the building, which brought along lots of benefits, for a number of different reasons. You know, the interfaces with the window EPDMs got a lot neater, rather than trying to rely on taking a VCL into your reveal from the inside and trying to get a purchase on an EPDM that way, which you can't really ever guarantee on, you know, as you would do on a typical scheme. And also, it's worth noting that the way that a Passivhaus air test is done for certification is to a different standard than your typical building regs compliance Part L air test. You're actually air testing and pressurizing the entire building, not individual dwellings. So it makes a lot more sense when you start looking at it from that perspective to actually put the airtight membrane around the outside of the building, which not only reduces the interfaces you've got with, you know, you don't have an interface at every slab level and every column junction. Everything just gets wrapped like a big parcel in some ways. And then you've just got your window interfaces to worry about, and any penetrations through that then, which are minimised because you're not fixing plasterboard fixings through it. You know, you've just got your brick ties and stuff like that, which can be controlled and managed a lot easier. We sort of try to deal with the airtightness enhancements, but also as a result of that, because the airtight membrane was on the outside of the building, it meant that we had sort of certain hold points where we did interim air tests on every floor level, and these are still ongoing, by the way. We're not finished, still a way to go, but we've been doing interim air tests on every single floor level as we were going up the building by pressurizing the floors above and below to sort of isolate floors, so we can get a realistic reading for just that particular floor level as the SFS has been installed. And then again, once the wrap type membrane is going on, and then again once the brick tie penetrations have been fixed through, just to see what the impact is, to make sure that everything's as we expect it to be before we progress up with the brickwork, so we don't end up in a position when we're at the end of the job, if we're getting failures on the airtight membrane, we're having to take brickwork down, which would obviously be catastrophic at practical completion. I mean, I've touched on airtightness already quite a bit there, but one key thing, and again, it all links back to early engagement. One thing that allowed us and gave us the comfort of being able to achieve the airtightness was early engagement with Procter, who supplied the wrap type products. And even though we had the opportunity to do this benchmark little sample on site, this little mock-up, because the scale of that wasn't really anywhere near the size of the full building, the results we got from that weren't necessarily relatable back to the actual air test, the air permeability targets for the full building air test. What it did do was it allowed us to do smoke tests and see where the weak points were and start improving certain details that were where we were experiencing air leakage before it all got before it got rolled out on site on a mass scale. But what Procter did in the engagement we had with them, they were able to provide us with lots of data, and they've actually done test rigs not just on their product on its own, but also with window junctions, with EPDM lapping on top of the membrane, with the membrane lapping on top of the EPDM in different ways. And also with brick ties fixing through it, and just to see what the drop off in performance is once all those interfaces are factored in. So and again, that really helps us get some comfort that what we was actually signing up to was achievable, which also, as you can probably appreciate, all took a little bit of time to get to that position. Installation tolerances is obviously a big one with Passivhaus, and we've talked about the 3 mil gaps in insulation. I'll come on my next slide. I'll come on to a few of the challenges that's posed on site. But in terms of how we tried to mitigate the risk of that in somewhat, it was more from a the way we tried to mitigate that risk was more about generating more of a cultural shift, and John sort of touched on it briefly in his section then. But if you have the opportunity Greenhaus, you'll notice as soon as you walk through the gates, you've got signs saying, this is Passivhaus site, gaps bigger than 3 millimeters. People are walking around with it on the high vis vest, as you saw from that slide before. There's even tape on the airtight layer saying, do not penetrate without permit. All sorts of different measures in place. The site induction has been tailored to a Passivhaus scheme, so that as soon as people step foot on site, it's drilled into them that this isn't your normal site. You can't just go doing what you normally do. So if you fix a hole through the airtight membrane and you realise it's in the wrong position, don't take the screw out. Make sure you drill another one, or come and let us know. Report it. You actually get a pat on the back. No one's going to give you a slap on the wrist. That kind of mentality. And the site team and Jess, you can see in the picture there, who's our Passivhaus champion. Her and the site team have really sort of grabbed it with both hands and took ownership of that culture. And I'm sure you can appreciate it. There was always a few teething issues when contractors first came on the site, and there was a bit of at first saying, we don't normally have to do this on a normal job, but because we've had to be to make sure we're achieving the what we have to achieve for practical completion and certification. We haven't let the standards slip, and it's ended up with a workforce on site that bought into it, and that nobody can get away with these things. And as Phil was mentioning, when you do work on site, it's just you can tell it's just everything's very neat and tidy. The insulation gaps, the way everything's installed is just to a different level in terms of the installation quality than any other project that you would go on, or certainly anything that we've experienced in the past. And then the collation of evidence. So obviously, is one of the other biggest elements of delivering a Passivhaus scheme. And we're talking about thousands and thousands of photographs from the moment materials turn up on site, to taking pictures of the barcode and the labels on packaging to prove that what's been delivered is actually what's on the drawing and what's in the specification, to pictures of every gap in the installation, to pictures of every joint on ducts lagging, to pictures of the slab edge and whether or not there's a gap as it's sort of as you've got concrete tolerances and stuff like that, to evidence that whatever's been agreed on the benchmark, our responsibility to then prove to the certifier at the end of the job and prove to the Passivhaus Institute that that standard has been maintained throughout the scheme. So there's literally thousands of pictures, and it's as John mentioned there, it's gave us an opportunity to sort of stress test in some ways our software that we're already using on schemes anyway, but it's allowed us to sort of develop bespoke Passivhaus quality assurance forms for every single interface, and that's now getting rolled out on a lot of our other schemes as well, to ensure that sort of we're learning from this and getting better as well across all jobs, not just Passivhaus jobs. And the fact that it's cloud-based, it's meant it's been a lot quicker and a lot more manageable for the site team. They can walk around with their iPads and take pictures of gaps in insulation or butt joints in insulation as evidence, and it's automatically loaded on the cloud onto the cloud. The certifier and the Passivhaus consultant who need to check it and sign it off automatically get notified. Same with commissioning sheets for MVHR units, etc. So it's been really positive from that perspective. And the middle point there that I just skipped over was that we've created a Passivhaus champion within the site team. And that was actually off the back of the advice from the Passivhaus consultant saying, you need this person in your team, and it just won't work without it. And we did have our reservations about it because, as you can imagine, when you get into a contract negotiation process, you're looking at what you might need to take out of the scheme to get it within budget. And there was a bit of a VE process we went through, and we were toying with the idea of, do we actually need this person? Is it something that the site team can do, the site manager can do, the project manager can do, I can do? But really, it has proven more than value for money to have that one person in our team who, Jess, who's in the picture there, who's like the one point of contact between what's happening on site on a day-to-day basis and the Passivhaus consultant who's checking the evidence, and also the certifier who comes to site and does some spot checks and making sure that they're happy, so we don't get to the end of the job and end up with a problem. But it also means that it allows the site managers to focus on what they should be doing on for the day-to-day jobs, and I sometimes refer to it as Passivhaus tunnel vision. It's very easy to fall into the trap when you're delivering a Passivhaus job that's very bespoke in its nature, and there's lots of little details and intricacies that you're not normally used to delivering, to sort of forget about some of the fundamental things that you normally make sure you pick up on and make sure you deal with. So I think Jess's involvement in the site team has been pivotal in allowing the rest of the site team to sort of get on with the day jobs in some regards and make sure that the other fundamentals of building a high-rise residential apartment block aren't getting forgotten about. Next slide, please. So yeah, just last slide. Apologies if I'm going a little bit over my time here. Some lessons learned, really, just to hopefully give a few people a bit of a flavour of what it is like delivering a Passivhaus scheme on a daily basis. So a few examples of some of the challenges we've faced sort of post-contract. So one thing we have found is that there's numerous examples of this, but I've just put a couple of them down there, is the difference in calculation methodologies. Passivhaus Institute want the data and want the evidence and what the actual supply chain and the market can offer. And I touched on the window example before, so I won't dwell on that. But another example of that would be the PV panels. So we got a technical data sheet and a technical submission from the electrical contractor for their PV panel layout and proposed specification. Which they had their own calculations on it for their what they were sort of predicting the generated output would be, and then when the Passivhaus designer got their hands on it, there's just another level of interrogation that they were asking about. Well, the spacing is slightly less than the way it's been tested between the panels. The angle of the panel is slightly different. The inverter efficiency is not quite what we would like it to be, and they actually got a completely different output in terms of generated energy from the PVs and what the supplier had done on their calculations. So I think that's just a bit of a lessons learned, and it's a bit of an eye opener, really, that sometimes what the market might tell you when they're selling you certain products and what the subcontractors might sometimes believe themselves in some regards, that what they're proposing doesn't actually achieve what they think it will. So a lot of it's based on generic data. It's based on certain things have only been tested in one scenario, and what Passivhaus does, it allows you to do bespoke calculations for absolutely everything on the building to make sure. And that's what, one of the big takeaways from Passivhaus is that it's almost guaranteeing that the building will perform the way it should perform. It theoretically will perform, because of all these extra checks. You don't just do typical SAP calcs for the purpose of EPCs and Part L compliance, where you might just be taking an average U value for the wall, an average U value for the window, an average U value for the roof, and generate your thermal efficiency that way. Every single bit on that facade has been thermally modelled, down to every SFS stud, down to every window bracket, down to the air bricks that penetrates it, to generate an actual realistic U value for the entire facade, and all that's fed into the Passivhaus model. And every time you update that Passivhaus model, which has been updated continuously throughout pre-construction, throughout the construction phase, as things have cropped up on site and we've had to change certain things, it's a live model. It gets updated continuously. We get an update in terms of the results. Heating demand is 50 per metre square per annum, and we're still currently at about 13.8, I think the last update we had. So we had a margin of contracts that we unfortunately managed to maintain. And again, that margin for design development on your heating demand and on your PER certification limit is fundamental, really, to make sure that if anything does crop up on site, you've got that little bit of buffer. Very similar to a BREEAM scheme, if anyone's familiar with working on BREEAM jobs, where you always target a little bit more than what you need for the for whatever certification you're going for. The next one there, so conflict between Passivhaus criteria and other regulations. So again, I touched on before that we believe this is this is the first sort of high-rise Passivhaus scheme that's been built post Grenfell, post Regulation 7. We didn't have the opportunity to use sort of rigid insulation or any combustible membranes or material. Obviously, we've gone down a fully non-combustible external wall to meet the minimum building reg requirements. So we are using mineral wool insulation. And when we first looked at this, and we understood that the 3mm gap in insulation was more about the butt joints between two pieces of insulation as you looked at them on elevation. Which actually we thought that mineral wool would make our life a little bit easier because it's compressible. You can almost oversize it, and when you put it together, you can compress it together, and therefore you can guarantee there's no gaps. What we hadn't appreciated was that the 3mm gap tolerance actually is applied in section as well. So a good example of one of the issues we had was when we was filling the SFS with mineral wool. We was using mineral wool roll. And when as soon as it comes out of the packet, as you can probably appreciate with mineral wool, it's a compressible material, so it has undulations in it where some of it's being compressed, some of it's not. So you're offering that up into the cavity of the SFS, and then as you're putting your plasterboard on it, if you was to look at it in section, it has got undulations in. It's got a bit of a wave to it. And the Passivhaus certified, when we was doing the benchmark, was pulling us up on this, saying, well, you've got a gap there behind your plasterboard. I'm going to have to give you a penalty on your U value. So we were saying, hang on a minute, we've still got the 100mm of mineral wool that's been specified in the cavity, and he was saying, no, it doesn't matter, that air gap isn't how that wall's been modelled. We've now modelled it with the air gap, and it does have an impact on thermal performance. So yeah, going back to that extra level of quality assurance to make sure that your building is performing exactly how it should perform. That's another good example of that. What we ended up doing in that scenario was actually we ended up overfilling the SFS with an extra 25mm of insulation. So we ended up putting 125mm insulation into a 100mm cavity. So over compressing it with the plasterboard to guarantee there wasn't any gaps. And what that ended up doing was because they then came back and said, because we was compressing the mineral wool more than 10%, then they had to apply a penalty to the performance of it, because if you compress mineral wool over 10%, you reduce the air pockets down to outside of its tolerance zone. But because we was using more insulation than what we should have been, the penalty kind of offset the extra insulation that we put in. So we ended up with a very similar U value than what had been originally specified to get over that particular problem. The next point there, I've got shortfalls of products available suitable for high-rise construction. So I won't touch on both of these. I'm conscious I'm probably running over on my time slot, but a good example was the hot water cylinders. And the one we'd originally specified was the 170-litre unit, which is with a built-in air source heat pump, which had a big enough duty and was big enough to service the 2-bed apartments on our scheme. When we actually delved into the detail of that post contract and started, looking at them, into a bit more detail, we quickly realised that that product actually comes with like a combined extract and intake flue type arrangement that only comes as plastic, and it's only tested and warranted with this plastic pipe. So there was no way we could actually pass that through our external wall because we were over 18 meters. We couldn't put anything combustible through the external wall. So the way we dealt with that is we had to actually upgrade the hot water cylinder to the next size up, which was a 200 litre unit. So we over-specified hot water cylinder, but the bigger unit actually comes with two separate ducts, a supply and extract ducts, which we could do in metal ductwork, similar to an MVHR type system and arrangement. So yeah, just a bit of a word of warning that a lot of the products that will get specified in a Passivhaus scheme haven't necessarily been used before in high-rise construction, and the actual supply chain and the supplier of that particular product wasn't exactly very helpful in helping us solve that problem and doing further test data on a metal flue arrangement, which left us having to upgrade the cylinder purely for that reason. The knock-on effect it's had to sort of non-Passivhaus trays can sometimes get missed as well, and one thing that sort of has tripped us up a little bit was the knock-on effect of the domestic hot water routes. So in a Passivhaus job, the domestic hot water, or certainly in our projects, one of the things we did put into the design enhancement list that was providing quite a significant improvement on the heating demand was the domestic hot water pipe work and running the pipe work directly from the cylinder to each individual outlet from a manifold off the cylinder, rather than a typical arrangement where you might have a pipe that's sort of a primary pipe and then branch off one pipe to every outlet. And the logic behind that is that you're not having to fill the full system every time you turn a tap on, which the way that the Passivhaus models that over the course of a year, it does actually generate quite a lot of heat loss. So what it resulted in is, because we've got multiple feeds going to every single outlet, not only was there more pipes that needed fire stopping, the pipes were a lot smaller. So we ended up with the original pipe spec that was supposed to be a 15 mil, ended up being a 10 mil, but a lot more of them. But that particular 10 mil pipe actually doesn't have any fire stopping test data for it, which we didn't really pick up until it was too late. So the way we actually dealt with that was to change to a copper pipe as they were passing through firewalls, so we could put an appropriate fire stopping detail onto them, which again has tripped us up a little bit, but nothing that we didn't solve. And then the final one I just wanted to touch on was just because it is quite sort of a benchmark, a unique project in some ways in being high-rise Passivhaus. There's been quite a lot of unfamiliar details to the actual Passivhaus designers and certifiers that we've had to overcome, and the SFS is one good example of that. As I mentioned before, every single SFS stud has had to be firmly modelled to sort of get an accurate U value on the external wall. But the Passivhaus Institute doesn't actually have, or didn't have at the time, a calculation methodology for doing that, or an approved calculation methodology of doing that. So we actually spent a lot of time just agreeing how we were going to calculate that thermal bridging impact of the SFS. Fortunately, it has actually since published a guidance document on how they would do it. So our scheme in some ways has actually been quite pioneering in that sense, in that it's helped sort of improve the Passivhaus Institute sort of guidance on high-rise construction. But yeah, there are little intricacies like that they haven't. That's potentially even though you might have appointed a Passivhaus designer or a Passivhaus certifier, but they don't necessarily always have all the answers because there's not many people who've worked on high-rise Passivhaus schemes. Another example of that was a smoke shaft. So because, and as I said before, because you're doing an air test on the wider building and not just individual dwellings, it brings into play things like smoke shafts, the corridors, stairwells, entrance lobbies, areas that you wouldn't normally put under pressure during an air test. So there's a few little intricate details that have had to be considered around there, and a good example of that is at the top of the smoke shaft. We've had to come up with like a bespoke arrangement with an additional damper in it that can actually meet the air tightness requirements for the Passivhaus air test. So yeah, hopefully I haven't bored everyone to death there. I appreciate I've been talking for a long time, and I will pass you on to Phil Summers from Salix.
Yes. Hello, my name's Phil Summers. I'm the Development Director at Salix Homes. I think, as Phil Marsden mentioned earlier, we were collaborating with the English City Funds on delivering an affordable scheme on Chapel Street, which is now called Greenhaus. We asked the question, could this go and be a Passivhaus certified scheme? And what I want to do is spend a little bit of time just explaining what our thinking was, what the issues are we considered at Salix to inform that decision. Next slide, please. So the first question is, would you pay more for a Passivhaus scheme? Interested on people's thoughts based on what they've heard already. Looking like most people would. That's really good. We're getting 85% people saying they would pay more. Still, people are a little bit unsure, but no, it's a really good thing. Can I have the next slide, please? So if I could just explain Salix's journey so far. For those people who don't know Salix Homes, we're a housing association in Salford. We stock transferred in 2015. We manage 8,500 homes. Actually, 3,000 homes are situated within 2 miles of Chapel Street. So we're very much about a placemaking. We have 19 high-rise apartment blocks, and we've been focused on delivering the stock transfer promises and the decent homes work. Obviously, the Grenfell disaster put a big hole in our business plans. So we've had to reschedule things, given the amount of high-rise apartments we have. But we spent over £114 million on our existing stock to date, and we're a founding partner of the government's early adopter scheme for building safety. We're also committed to another £11 million on decarbonisation of low, medium-rise blocks. So essentially, we're about people, about placemaking, about investment in communities. Our growth agenda is not determined by how many homes we can build, but how much we can invest in our existing stock base. Next slide, please. So the board's view and the executive management's view in looking at Passivhaus is that we think it's just simply good business for Salix and our customers. It supports our customers' health and economic needs, and it's completely aligned with our key partners' carbon reduction and placemaking aspirations. And really, what does that mean? Salford is one of the 10 authorities that make up the Greater Manchester Combined Authority. GMCA has an ambition to create 30,000 or deliver 30,000 social rented homes by 2038 that are zero carbon. And as we've seen in Homes England's strategic plan released last month, great emphasis is placed on innovation, placemaking, sustainability. And if you read that document, you will notice that the Crescent area in Salford, which is within half a mile of Greenhaus, is identified as one of the key priorities. So for us, it just makes absolute perfect sense. If we want to grow the organisation, we have 3,000 homes in this locality. Why would we not embrace zero carbon? Why would we not embrace Passivhaus, given our strategic partners who fund us want to see these types of homes brought forward? Next slide, please. We talked before about the economic benefits in terms of fuel. Well, yeah, Salford is getting very, very wealthy now. There's a lot of investment going in Salford. It's improving a lot. But Salix, out of 8,400 tenants, 700,000 of those are in receipt of welfare benefits. Salford is still the 18th most deprived area in the UK, and 15% of all our residents are affected by some form of fuel poverty. And when we look at Passivhaus and our calculations based on the 2-bedroom apartment, which is the primary typology within Greenhaus, we're looking at £40 for heating and hot water per month for that dwelling, as opposed to something around about £95 for a similar apartment where gas has been used, a gas boiler is being used. Now, if we talk about current building standards and using all electric, the saving is even greater. So we think, if we can build Passivhaus, we are putting money back into our residents and our tenants' pockets, which will be spent in the local economy. Next slide, please. We're also talking about health inequality. Phil mentioned previously about the constant flow of clean air and how this reduces organic compounds. Salford, again, is the highest mortality rate for lung disease in England. We have 155 deaths per 100,000 people. Second in the UK, but top in England. It's a statistic we don't want. We know that the Passivhaus has exceptional indoor air quality to pollutants that are a major cause of respiratory illness and allergies. And we know the internal environment reduces the risk of airborne infection. What you probably don't know is asthma takes £3 billion of the NHS budget per annum. Another 1.4 billion is spent on chronic pulmonary disease. These are major things that are caused by the poor quality of air and lifestyle of residents. If we can start tackling that, we can see massive savings to not just to the NHS, but also improve the health of our residents. Next slide, please. It's also about protecting the building fabric. Again, We've heard from Eric Wright and Muse about the high quality design, about the rigor within designing a passive house, about the materiality. We know that we can reduce condensation, get rid of it completely, get rid of mold, get rid of dampness through the exceptional air tightness, providing the MVHR is saved on. At Salix, we spend between 15 and 20% of our budgets each year on dealing with the consequences of dampness and condensation. If we can get that down to nil or less than 2%, that is a massive saving which we can invest back into our communities. Next slide, please. But I think it's all great theoretically. We've got to measure this. We've got to measure this ambition. We know, or we feel that it's going to be benefits in terms of fuel savings. We know, or we feel it's going to be benefits in terms of air quality, and we think there's going to be benefits in terms of our repair expenditure. But Greenhaus we're going to use as an opportunity through the installation of humidity sensors and home energy monitors to track the air quality, to track the energy costs of our residents through their tenancy. We're setting up a study with Salford University to also measure and track the health of residents. We'll be asking them to do a questionnaire, sign up, and periodically review that questionnaire to see about the times that they have to visit doctors or hospitals and for what treatment. And we're going to compare repair expenditure within non-passive high-rise blocks. This, for Salix, is not a pilot study. This is the first of 6 passive house schemes that we're planning over the next 4 to 5 years. We're already in discussions with Eric Wright and Muse about the second scheme, which we're hoping to start before Christmas of another 100 apartments. And we've got plans for another 4 sites of delivering another 450 units. So with that sort of density of 600 units, we'll be able to really measure some key data about how passive house performs in the social housing sector. Next slide, please. But we also recognise it's a change of relationship with our tenants and a change of the way we communicate with our tenants. So yes, we need to do on some carbon literacy. Each resident will receive a quick start guide and detailed user guide on how best to reduce energy and live within a passive house. We'll set up dedicated websites for our Greenhaus residents and later on our other residents to share their experiences. And we need to incentivise tenants to share information with us, particularly about the health and general access to the medical support. And what that means for Salix is we've set up a dedicated support team purely for passive house customers, a specific passive house manager who's going to direct the specific training for lettings, void management, repairs and area teams. We need to start up and set up the establishment of supply chains for operations and maintenance. And we need to understand residents' lifestyles to maximise health benefits for living in the passive house. As I said, this is the beginning of our journey. So lessons learned is put these things into place now, and you can then develop that business case to make it better for your residents and for your communities. Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much, Phil. I know Salix is really committed to sharing key learnings from the projects, and it's great to see the collaboration going on around Greenhaus and everyone's role in working for the community who will be living in Greenhaus and to help them to get the full benefits of the homes. So that concludes the presentation part of the session, and I'm now going to hand over to Tamsin Hart-Jones, who's Head of Cities and Major Conurbations in our Northern Markets Partners and Places team, and she'll lead the Q&A session along with our Homes England expert, Amir Poole, who is a manager in the Technical Excellence team, and he's already been answering questions in the chat and will join the panel in this section. So it's over to you, Tamsin.
Thank you so much, and thank you everybody for your questions. There's been so many questions as we've gone along through the session, and thanks so much to the presenters for all of your insights so far. So I think for me, when I was looking through the questions, there was a couple of really key themes coming through in the questions. How does it work to live in? How does it stack up both in the short and long term? What's that policy framework? And is there a skills challenge associated, and how can we tackle that? So if I could ask Phil M in the first instance, I know you've answered it in the chat, roughly what do you think is the approximate cost uplift in providing passive house over buildings that are designed and delivered to Future Home standards or BREEAM standards?
Yeah, BREEAM's perhaps a bit more difficult to answer. We perhaps see BREEAM being more applicable to commercial buildings, not perhaps really relevant in this respect, but we're doing quite a lot of work looking at the implications of the Future Home standard. Obviously, there's been some new Part L building regs just released, which has closed the gap in terms of the cost uplift. The overall cost is the same, unfortunately, but the cost uplift to go from the new building regs to passive house is now probably more like 7-8% instead of the 10% we had at Greenhaus. The future home standard is interesting. That I think really almost closes the gap, particularly on design stages. The requirements to meet the future home standard are pretty well aligned with passive house. It's slightly different, but if you're meeting the future home standard, which we're all going to have to do in 2025, which isn't that long off, then you're likely meeting the design requirements of the passive house standards. A couple of things that are slightly different, but be there or thereabouts. So the cost uplift, I think, will sort of close then. Obviously, to get passive house certification, there are some additional costs associated with that in terms of the certifiers and going through the certification process, but they're not particularly, they're not particularly significant. So I think that probably highlights the sort of challenge that we've got as an industry, in that we're showcasing this as an exemplar project, which it is, because it's one of very few. But actually, in 2 years' time, everything that's built will have to meet that. We're obviously, as an organisation, looking about how we can use Greenhaus to go further and do better. And by the time 2025 comes around, we're building buildings that are way in excess of that. But I think it highlights the challenge. So yeah, I think it would close the cost gap. Like we say on the passive house bit, we really like is that the future home standard is very much going to be a design-based assessment, like your EPC ratings are and your SAP calcs and all that sort of stuff. The passive house bit makes sure that it's built correctly. So I think even when we get to future home standard, we'll still be looking at passive house certification.
Brilliant, thank you. And could I ask Phil S as well, just in terms of the in terms of how you've made it stack up overall? There are a few questions in there around both the immediate costs of construction and those long-term management costs. Could I ask you about how you've made this one stack up?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, Tamsin. I mean, as I said, our appetite for doing passive house is clearly aligned with the strategic policies of both GMCA and Homes England, and both organisations have been very, very receptive to discussing with us higher grant levels for delivering the scheme. So we did secure monies from GMCA through their Brownfield Fund, and we got a significant investment from Homes England for the affordable rent and social rent tenures, probably more so than other similar types or that type of tenure scheme within the area. A lot of the properties are intermediate rent, which is 80% of the market. We have benefited from the sort of gentrification that we're seeing in that part of Salford. It's less than 10 minutes from the Manchester city centre. So with the sort of rental stream and the higher levels of grant, we were able to make the business case and make it stack up at our internal appraisals and parameters agreed with the bank.
That's brilliant. Thank you both. Another of the key things that I think came across is some of those skills challenges, and I think both in terms of the obviously construction and through to the management and maintenance. John and or Sam, could I ask you around your view around the skill challenge and indeed the skill challenge, particularly around people who are able to have the skills to service the systems such as the MVHR?
Yeah, I can touch on that, and I'll let John pick up on anything he thinks I've missed. But I think, again, without repeating myself, it comes back to early engagement of supply chain again, and allowing the trades to get comfortable with these products. I mean, they're not all new products. They are products that have been used on low-rise housing for a number of years, or in different applications. It's just maybe using them in a slightly different way, or products that have only recently come to the market, like the membrane I was talking about, and just getting more contractors familiar with those products, and at least giving them the opportunities to become familiar with them, so that there isn't that skills gap. And I think I also touched on as well that there are training courses available that we put all of our staff on, and we've made sure that the subcontractors, black hats, have all gone on the passive house contractors training course, and at least there's an appreciation within our supply chain now of passive house and what it is and the requirements. But yeah, I wouldn't say there's a skill shortage for delivering passive house. I think it is something that can be managed.
I'd agree with everything that Sam said there. I think the only thing to add to there is it's just, and Sam covered it again in his slides very thoroughly. It's a lot about a cultural shift. So the people and the supply chains designers have the skills to provide the passive house scheme. It's just making sure that they understand the lack of margin for error, and it's just making sure people turn up and it's drilled into them of what we're trying to achieve. And once people understand that, they buy into it. You know, they're fully into it, and it's fine. But it is a bit of a mindset shift for some people. And that's kind of the biggest barrier, really.
So true, and I was actually going to ask Philette a question about that, about its cultural changes as well, isn't it, in terms of how a resident uses the property as well. But you answered that question in that slide, because it is very much fundamentally about a different way of using a home. We had lots of questions in the chat around overheating and the sense of you know, how do you manage a passive house property?
No, I mean, we're going to have to spend a lot of time with the residents and our staff, getting them to engage and think about our relationship with residents differently. That carbon literacy training in-house is critical, and we need to explain to residents exactly how, not just don't turn the MVHR off, but lifestyle has an impact on fuel costs, and go through them how best to maximise living in a passive house. We've already started that process. Other housing associations have done it in the past, and we're learning from their experience. These dwellings are looking to be handed over in sort of February and March next year, so we've got a bit of time, but not that much to get our sort of internal structures and systems in place. But we're working on that, you know, right now.
Brilliant, thank you. And I'll just bring Amir in to ask a question. There was a couple of questions in there around the kind of policy framework that sits within. You know, what are various local authority policies, and what's the difference between Passive House Plus and Future Home Standards? I think it's a good kind of question to ask in terms of what is that policy context at the moment, and what does that look like in different places?
Thanks, Tamsin. Yes, so I mean, I think I've alluded to it slightly in the chat, but I think, well, first of all, I mean, what a great session, and what a fantastic set of presentations, and there's a lot of interesting technical discussion in the chat as well, isn't there? So we could carry on all day on this, I think, but just giving a sort of a brief overview, I think, you know, the schemes I've seen, certainly the difference has been passive house tends to be a higher fabric first approach, so it's thicker walls and windows and so on, so more energy efficient, whereas the Future Home Standard is sort of still relying on a degree of grid decarbonisation, so that would be, you know, offshore wind or solar farms elsewhere, etc. So in my view, probably passive house is a stronger you know, standard than perhaps the FHS, but we're working with a lot of within Homes England, a lot of the industry bodies, you know, right through from Future Homes Hub and the developers who are kind of probably more commercial in their approach about how they want to bring this in, right through to Letty and the Good Homes Alliance, which is sort of a bit more deep green, and, you know, kind of are pushing for much sort of higher fabric efficiency. So we'll see where some of that lands. But I've made a couple of points in the chat also about when we're not on non-exemplar schemes, you know, if you've got marginal sites in the north and so on, if you do a lot of fabric improvements, you might actually lose a couple of units, which, you know, then brings the viability of the site into question. So some developers we're working with are looking at other methods, such as, you know, renewable energy technology and so on, rather than perhaps just the building fabric itself. So I think Homes England generally won't prescribe a method or a technology. We tend to be technology agnostic, but we're moving back, if you've seen our strategic plan, towards being a bit more prescriptive, I think, on environmental issues, and it's likely that we'll probably mandate carbon factors or something of that nature, of which passive house and other methods might be one method that our partners would use to achieve that.
Brilliant, thank you all so much. I'm going to hand us back to Jane.
Thank you very much, Tamsin. That's fantastic, and thank you to all of our contributors on this session. I'd just like to finish with a few final thoughts and key messages from the panel. Starting with Phil from Muse. Phil, in a few words, if there's one takeaway message from your experience so far with Greenhaus, what would that be?
I think there's a few you could pick out, but probably the key one for me is working in partnership. So working in partnership with a funder like Salix and a contractor like Eric Wrights, who's got that can-do positive approach. That's absolutely key for me.
Great. And Kurt, do you want to add anything here?
I think Phil's just stolen it, really, because I said at the start it was about partnership, but I
Yeah.
think it's about being bold. I think we've got to tackle some of these issues head on, and that's irrespective of whether there is a specific policy requirement. There is an opportunity for us working in partnership to tackle things head on.
Yeah, absolutely. Eric Wright, some final words from you, Sam?
Yeah, I'd echo Phil's and Kurt's statements, but it is about collaboration and early engagement. You know, everyone's got to be in the tent together from the beginning, and being honest, because when you tackle a project like this and you're trying to pioneer something, there are problems, and it's being able to have those open and honest conversations with everybody to find the solutions, whether that be upstream with the client funders and stakeholders, or downstream with the supply chain. So yeah, no, that's definitely the most important thing.
Thank you. And lastly, Phil from Salix.
Yeah, no, I think for those housing associations or local authorities looking to do Passivhaus, do it. Be bold, be visionary, embrace the challenge. Government wants us to go that way. It's in some ways it's our duty and responsibility to take up that challenge and run with it. It's good for our residents, it's good for our communities, it's good for your business. Why wouldn't you do it?
Brilliant. Thank you. What a great way to end. And thank you very much again to our panel, and thank you to Tamsin and Amir. Thank you everyone in the audience for joining us today, and I hope you've enjoyed the session. Goodbye.